Today, I would like to turn it over to Jim Dixon. Your video. So I will tell you a little bit about Jim. He has been writing about food and cooking in the Portland area for over 20 years. He is the founder of Wellspent Market, great place to get all the pantry items you need to round out your CSA. He is a eating fan and eater, and that's why he cooks. And he started his business when he realized that he went through so much olive oil, he should just be importing it himself. So he started with an olive oil CSA program, and now you can get all kinds of special goodies at Wellspent Market to help you do your cooking. And with that, Jim, you ready to take it away?
I'm ready. Thanks, Holly. Hey, I want to say I'm honored to be here to fill in for my friend Catherine Demling of Cook With What You Have. She's a much better teacher than I am, but we share the same love for vegetables. If you're a CSA veteran or just thinking about joining a CSA, I urge you to take a look at Catherine's website, Cook With What You Have. It shows you how to prep, store, and cook everything you might find in your CSA box. She's also got lists of all the pantry items that make cooking easier. She and I both cook very similarly. She's got a lot of recipe templates that help you use up all the little bits and leftovers that are in your refrigerator. Okay, so again, cook with what you have. Check it out. Okay, let's see what we got in this winter CSA box today. I kind of like to take a look at produce when a CSA box comes in and sort of think about what kind of things are going to last a little longer and what kind of things need to be used right away, eaten soon, first on the list. So this time of year, we're going to get lots of root vegetables. Things like these carrots. This is a celery root or celeriac. It's really ugly, but one of my favorite things to eat. Jerusalem artichokes, also called sunchokes. Got a couple of turnips in here. These beautiful watermelon radishes. These look a little like a turnip, but I'll cut one just so you can see how cool they are. They're really a beautiful vegetable. You can eat these raw in salads, but also very good roasted or pickled. Really great vegetable. Got a couple onions and a winter squash. We're kind of getting to the end of the winter squash season. Winter squash are called winter squash because they're meant to last through the winter. And a good winter squash is harvested in the fall, and then they usually have to cure for a few weeks before they're good to eat. But then they store your root cellar for months. So this is a nice little butternut. We've got a few other things. These look like spinach, but these are tatsoi. This is a green that's related to bok choy. This is the kind of thing that you see something like this near. It's nice that they're all cleaned and bagged, but they're not going to last for a really long time. So these are things you want to eat right away. One little trick I use to make them last a little longer is I'll par cook them or cook them a little bit. Just drop them into some boiling water, which is just about boiling over here. So we'll do that. This is salted boiling water. I'm going to put the whole bag in there. Just going to let those cook for about a minute or so. Like spinach, they cook very quickly. They're ready to go. But once they're cooked, they'll last much longer in the refrigerator. They'll store in a much smaller container, and they're ready to eat. So you can just pull them out. You can finish them off by heating some olive oil and garlic in a pan and rubbing around in there and just kind of warming them up a little bit. Or you can use them in any recipe that calls for cooked spinach. Let's put them in a bowl. Like I said, it just takes about a minute to blanch them. They really still have really nice color. And like this, they'll keep in the refrigerator for longer than they would if they left uncooked. So that's a good little trick. And that applies to a lot of little leafy green type vegetables. You can just par cook them a little bit and then they'll last much longer. So we'll just set these for now. Do something with those a little later maybe. The vegetable, I'm going to go a couple other things. Things like these, these look similar, but these are some scallions or green onions. And these are leeks. They're both member of the allium families. These kind of things, quite often I'll just trim some of these loose tops off so they'll store smaller, compact for putting in the refrigerator. You can save these, make stock out of them, or put them in your compost. The vegetable I'm going to cook today to show you how to cook is really probably my favorite vegetable of all, cabbage. It doesn't get a lot of love, although I've noticed some people are starting to write more about it, but it's a brassica, like cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts are all in the same family. They're all vegetables that are very, very good for you. The cabbage in particular is inexpensive. It's super versatile. You can eat it raw or cooked, and it's delicious. So it just tastes great. So today I'm going to make the kind of thing I eat on a regular basis. It's going to be cabbage and beans with a little onion. So first, about a half a cabbage is this is kind of a small one, but a half a cabbage is about the place to start. So I'll just cut it in half and save half. Before I get into this, let me talk about, I also love beans. I cooked some earlier, and I cook beans every week. I'm always trying to persuade people to cook more dry beans. Canned beans are easy, convenient, but they just don't have as much flavor. Years and years ago, I learned from this grower, Anthony Boutard at Ayers Creek Farm, that if you buy a better variety bean dry, your beans are taste much, much better. These Ayers Creek beans, actually, if you do the $100 donation, there's some of these Ayers Creek beans in your swag bag. So, and like I said, I eat beans constantly, every day beans. So I'm always cooking them, and I have them cooked in the refrigerator. It's a really easy thing to do. I'll take about a half a pound of beans, which is about a cup. I have a little bean pot like this. I put them in my bean pot with roughly 3 to 4 cups of water, big spoonful of salt, glug, glug, glug of olive oil. I put them in the oven at about 225, and I leave them in there till they're done. The time can vary depending on the beans. If they're drier, bigger, smaller, usually 3 to 4 hours. I always tell people, if you smell the beans cooking, check and add water. You just need to keep them covered with water. So anyway, so that's my bean rant. I love to tell people to cook more beans. So I've got a pot of beans here. So we're going to make cabbage and beans. We'll start by taking one of these little onions that we got in the farmer's market. We're going to chop it up. I'm going to cook it in some olive oil to get it started while we chop up the cabbage. Cute little red onions from the market. And once read some cooks say that there's no food without onions, and it's really true. I think almost probably 90% of things I cook start with chopping an onion. And all the members of the allium family, the onion, garlic, shallots, and leeks, sometimes called aromatic vegetables, but they add a lot of flavor to things. So when I cut onions, I like to cut them in half so we have a flat side down. Just makes it a little safer for your knife. Cut it a few ways this way. Turn it over. Chop it coarsely.
Hey Jim, can you tell us what kind of beans those are?
The beans I have today are Zolfini beans. They're small white beans. I'm sorry, they're Purgatorio beans, another small white bean. There are literally hundreds of varieties of beans. Most beans are from the New World, except for fava beans. And they're bred in different areas, and they develop different characteristics. They're all related. They're all basically in the same genus and species. So to cook this, use one of my favorite implements in the kitchen, the cast iron skillet. It's hot. We'll add a little bit of olive oil. Usually I say drizzle in some olive oil. Enough to cover the bottom of the pan with a very thin layer is a good place to start, which is probably a couple of tablespoons. But the good thing about olive oil is it tastes delicious, so you can use as much as you want. This is what's called a bench scraper. It's a very handy tool for transferring food. My kitchen has not got the most ergonomic or great layout with the stove from the cutting board, so I always have something I can carry food over to the stove with. So we'll put those in the pan. I'm going to put a little pinch of salt in there and get those started. And I'm going to put this stuff in the compost. All right, now to the cabbage. So a lot of recipes will say core the cabbage. This always drives me crazy because I have this philosophy: if it's edible, you should eat it. You know, unless it detracts from the dish. If it's edible, you can eat it. A cabbage core is perfectly edible. And once it's cut up, you won't even notice it. So I usually cut them into quarters to start, cut down through like that to cut out the core. And then I just chop it small. Which means chopping a few ways this way, turn it like this. Nobody will know the core is in there. This applies to things that you eat raw too. Coleslaw, you can do the same thing, just cut it up small. And typically, depending on how big of pieces I want, I usually, these quarters are nice because the flat side lays down on the cutting board. You can cut through this way a few times, straight down, and you cut it the other way. Cabbage likes to fly around your kitchen, so there'll probably be some on the floor. Good if you have a dog for this, which we do. He loves cabbage. If you're making something like coleslaw or something, you might want to cut a little smaller, but for most times for cooked cabbage, it doesn't have to be super small or super uniform, just chopped up into a pile. All right, we're gonna let these onions cook for a little minute here. Don't need to cook too much, just soften up, start to turn translucent. And for this, I'm going to bring the pan to the cutting board. All right, so this is a small head of cabbage, but a half a cabbage is just about the right amount for a 10-inch skillet. And we're going to use the other half for something else. So put this on a kind of a medium flame. Just let it go for a while. Another great thing about cabbage is, in a dish like this, you can cook it hot and for just a few minutes and get a little bit brown. You can turn the temperature down, let it simmer for a while and get a little softer. It's great either way. So we'll take the other half of this cabbage, and we're going to cut it a little bit finer, because this we're going to make into something I call lightly fermented cabbage. It's similar to coleslaw, and it's actually really the first step when you're making coleslaw. The first thing you do when you make coleslaw is salt the cabbage. I'm going to cut the core up again. I'll cut this cabbage a little bit finer this time. It's about 4 or 5 cuts through each quarter. Turn it over, chop it again. Shuffle this half. It's good to have a nice sharp knife. If you don't have one, you can spend a lot of money on knives, but there's a brand called Victorinox, which is very commonly used in commercial kitchens, and they're about $30 or $40. There's local sharpeners that'll sharpen your knife, but a sharp knife makes a huge difference in the kitchen. So I've got the cabbage chopped up. I cheated and weighed this cabbage ahead of time. The total cabbage was about 500 grams, and I like to use grams. They're just easier to do the math. You want about 2% of weight by salt. So we have a 500 gram cabbage. Half of that is 250 grams. 5% of that is 5 grams of salt, which is this much. I carefully weighed it out ahead of time. So we're going to take the cabbage, put it in a bowl. Like I said, this is really basically the first step of making coleslaw. If you made coleslaw, you'd ferment it much longer. Sauerkraut, I'm sorry. I make a lot of coleslaw too. If you're making sauerkraut, this is the first step. Got the cabbage in here, 5% of weight by salt. This is fine sea salt, but any salt, and it's better to weigh salt, because if you use like a kosher salt flakes are bigger and fluffier, and it'll be different volume than that salt. So it's always good to weigh salt, especially for baking things. Then you want to just, like I said, if you're making coleslaw, generally you crush the cabbage a little bit with your hands. It breaks some of the cell walls and releases some of the juices. And that is it. Now this cabbage I'll cover. I'll let it sit on the counter overnight. And if you were making sauerkraut, then the next day you would pack it into a jar and let it ferment for anywhere from 15 to 20 days or so. This I'll just put in the refrigerator and start eating it. You can add it to salads. You can saute it. It's great. It's a very useful thing to have, and it keeps for quite a long time. So I'm going to set that over here. Go back to the stove. See how our cabbage is doing. So we're getting some nice color on the cabbage. It's getting nice and brown. Put in a plug for one of my other second favorite utensil in the kitchen, the silicone spoonula. Very, very handy. I cook a lot with those things. All right. So the cabbage is cooked away. And like I said, you can cook this long or short. Doesn't really matter. It'll be pretty good no matter how you do it. I'm going to go a little bit longer. And then we're going to add some beans to it here in a minute. Beans are ready. And at the end, we're going to add a little vinegar because vinegar brightens things up. It's sort of a secret ingredient in the kitchen that not many people use a lot of. Let me show you my bean pot here. Set this over here out of the way. So the nice thing, one reason I like cooking the beans in the oven is you end up with just about the right amount of juice. Or bean stock. It's not super watery beans, and it's very handy to have. I mean, you can boil them on the stove and get more stock. And the beauty of cooking dried beans is the broth that they cook is delicious. But I kind of like them like this. They're just about the right amount of broth in there. So we're going to bring the pan back over here. And we're going to put some beans in here. You see, they're carefully measured, like pretty much everything in my kitchen. I'll turn the heat down just a little bit. We'll let these cook through. The beans are already cooked. They just need to warm up a little bit. Let the flavors meld a little bit. And then we'll just finish this with a little splash of vinegar. This is a product that we sell, and they're just the best in America. They're very long, slow fermentation, so they have a lot of flavor. But the main thing that you're looking for is that brightness of the acid flavor. You could use a squeeze of lemon or another vinegar. Just put a little splash in there. Not very much. Stir that up, and then those are ready to eat. This is the kind of that Catherine and I make all the time. It's a pantry ingredient that we like to have on hand, and it's like I said, it's really nice to have cooked beans in your refrigerator. It's a really, really good thing to have in your house at all times. And cabbage cooks really quickly. So here in like 15 minutes, we've got a quick, simple meal. You could pair this with either a simple protein or just eat it on its own. Maybe add some rice or something to it. It's ready to go. The other thing I wanted to make, we got in our CSA box, are these Brussels sprouts. I love Brussels sprouts. They're another member of the cabbage family. Most people seem to think that you need to cook them whole, and I really think they're much better if you cut them up. So for these, and sometimes I'll even I'll cut them in half like this. You can see that, and then shred them. Just cut them straight down like that. And these are great for salads. You can eat them raw. They're very good. They also cook very quickly this way. And we'll just add those to the other thing I'm going to cook. But this dish, I'm going to quarter them. The nice thing about Brussels and most of the brassica family, the cabbage family, is they can withstand quite a bit of heat. And these will caramelize very nicely in a hot pan. So I'm cutting them in half, cutting the halves in half again. And that gives us two flat sides. So when they're in the hot pan, that flat side will caramelize quickly. Much of cooking in general is kind of a repetitive standing at the counter and cutting things up. It's really not magic, and it really just takes practice. It's the kind of thing you do it enough You get very used to it, and you can look at the vegetables in your CSA box and just pull them out. So anyway, so like I said, we're gonna caramelize these, and this is one dish where I reverse the order of cooking a lot. Quite often you'll be cooking the onions first. You want to get the onions soft, the alliums, for flavor. And sometimes there's other aromatic vegetables like carrots or celery, and you soften those in oil, and then you add something to them. But because we're going to cook these quite hot, we're going to do them first. And if I do the onions this hot, they tend to burn a little bit. All right, that's probably enough for the pan. We'll do that. Another skillet. So over here out of the way. So we're gonna let this get hot for just a minute or two. Add enough oil to give the pan, the bottom of the pan, a nice coat. And actually, we'll just throw these in. We're gonna let those get nice and hot. There's a lot of, one of the things when I've been doing this olive oil thing for quite a long time, and I talk a lot about olive oil. And one question I always get from people is like, well, you shouldn't cook in olive oil. It has a low smoke point. This is a bit of information that's floating around for a long time, but good olive oil, real extra virgin olive oil really has a smoke point that's fairly high. It's anywhere between 375 and 420. And you never really cook oil if your oil is smoking, it's burning. So you really don't want to ever heat your oil to the smoke point. But olive oil is perfectly good for all kinds of cooking. In Italy, they deep fry in it, which is usually about 350 or so. So anyway, the phrase I hate when I'm reading about cooking is using neutral oil. It's like, why use a neutral oil? It doesn't taste very good. Olive oil tastes delicious. And if you cook your food in good olive oil, it tastes much better. So that's my olive oil plug. So we've got this on pretty high temperature. See, the flame's pretty good. They're sizzling away, and it will take a few minutes for these to caramelize. You try to shake them around, get them flat side down, but it doesn't really matter too much because they'll all get nice and brown eventually. And while those are doing that, we're going to get onion ready to go in there with them. Well, like I said, we'll put it in afterwards. And this might be a good time if we have any questions to bring them up, because this is going to take a few more minutes to cook to get this ready. So I'll let Holly take a look at the. No questions. Well,
caramelized onions and the braised cabbage. It's delicious.
Yeah. Let's get this ready. Slice this a little bit like this, and we'll throw this onion in after those are all caramelized. Utensils. This dish is going to be a little variation of one I learned a long time ago from a couple of local Portland chefs, a guy named David Padberg, another one named Jason French. Jason is the chef and owner of Ned Led. And David, when I learned this from them, they both were cooking at Clark Lewis. David's moved back to Oklahoma City and he has a restaurant there, but they would always say, Jim, and I adapted a little bit. They'd say, Jim, use a lot. They cook it in butter. They say, Jim, use a lot more butter than you think you need. So I cook it in olive oil, and you can use a little more than you think you need. And then eventually we're going to add some mustard to it, which is unusual, but it's really good. And they would say the same thing. Put a lot more than you think you might need in there. And it's a Brussels sprout recipe that's really good for people that don't think they like Brussels sprouts. You know, a lot of sort of the old story about Brussels sprouts is that they're boiled to death whole. And I think that's part of the problem is when they're whole, it takes a little longer to cook them through than tender. And to be honest, I've never really experienced this, but cabbage has kind of got some people claim it has what they call the boarding house smell. Like cooked cabbage gets an unusual aroma. There's a lot of sulfur compounds in cabbage, and that may be part of it, but it's never really bothered me at all. But Brussels sprouts in general, like, people have bad memories of boiled to death Brussels sprouts from Thanksgiving or something. That seems to be when they're cooked a lot, but it's not absolutely necessary to cook them that long. And again, cutting them in small pieces like this, cooking them hot, they'll get tender enough, and I'll show you. You can see they're getting some nice color on them. Nice and brown. Happen pretty quickly. And it's almost impossible to burn these things. You can cook for quite a while. But when they get a little bit of color like this, it's about ready. We'll add the onion.
Jim, we had a question here about unfiltered olive oil. Can you talk about that?
Well, those are cooking out. Somebody asked about unfiltered olive oil. So most good olive oil may or may not be filtered. The main reason is after it's pressed, olive oil still has a lot of fine particles and sediments from the crushed olives. And most olive oil producers will put the oil after it's been pressed. They'll usually take a little out to try right away because they want to see what it tastes like. But then they'll sit it in a tank and let it settle, and let the sediments will settle to the bottom of the tank. Then they rack the oil off the top. Sometimes they'll filter again. Big industrial producers will filter through high pressure. Smaller producers may filter by gravity through cotton. The main reason you want the oil is often filtered is to get the particles out, because if it sits in the particles sit in the oil for too long, you can get a flavor defect called muddy sediment. It starts to taste it. So unfiltered is really not better or worse. It's just different. And there's nothing wrong with it. But again, if it's been in the bottle too long, it can get some off flavors. I'm going to add a little more olive oil to this pan.
We had another question about trimming the ends off of Brussels sprouts. Is that necessary?
It's not absolutely necessary. Look at them. You can see the ends of these Brussels sprouts. If they're starting to get a little dark and oxidized, you might want to trim them off. But these were probably just plucked off the stem today, or within a day or two. If you can find them on the stalk, it's the way I prefer to buy them, like the farmer's market, and sometimes the better produce section will have Brussels sprouts still on the stalk. And it's usually, they're much less expensive that way. Brussels sprouts tend to be $3 or $4 a pound. And I've bought stalks that are like $3 and it's like 2 pounds of Brussels sprouts. So that's how I produce it. But no, you don't really need to trim this part off. It's perfectly fine. The stalks themselves can be quite tough. All right. Here's so the onions are just starting to soften up a little bit. Let me show you all what they look like. Onions are not really super done, but they're translucent, so they're tender enough. And in this dish, that's perfect. Don't want the sprouts to cook too long, but they're getting some nice little caramelization in there. So to that, I'm going to add some mustard, and this is just a locally made whole grain mustard. You might be able to. Like I said, they're very tough. So you probably would have to, you might be able to boil them down a bit and discard them. I don't know how much flavor they'd add. And you might be able to peel them like a broccoli stalk. But I know from experience of cutting them down, because you frequently have to cut them to get them out of the grocery store because they're this long. So I usually have the guys cut them in half and put them in a bag. And they're very, very woody. So if you peel down to the very core, maybe. Okay, and then to this Brussels sprout dish, we're just got a teeny tiny bit of honey. Yeah, you could use any kind of sweetener. I found that Brussels sprouts and all the brassica family, the cabbage family, vegetables in general, benefit from a touch of sweetener sometime. Honey, maple syrup, whatever you like. It's not absolutely necessary, but especially in a dish like this where you have some contrasting flavors, it's a nice touch. So let me show this. So here's the Brussels sprouts with mustard. And this, the good thing to do would be to taste it because we didn't really put much salt in here. It could use a touch, but it's not bad. All right. Any more questions in there?
Wow, you knocked out those recipes.
We did. We knocked them out pretty fast. One thing I like to do a lot of, for a while, I had a day job that was doing produce demonstrations. So, and a big part of what I did a lot of was tell people how to prep their vegetables in the produce department. So let me do that for a little bit with some of these. We'll look at this celery root. This is a great vegetable. This one's actually very, very clean. Quite often you get them and there's like all these hairy roots on the end and little bits of dirt in here. And a lot of people really don't know what to do with these, but they are so tasty. The easiest way to get a celery root is just to start gently slicing at the root end. And you can see these little hairy, like little crevasses filled with dirt. Just kind of cut off some of this stuff. And you can peel the top with a swivel peeler. But for the bottom, it's really best, I think, just to kind of shave it down. Like Alex says, now you could cut a little deeper and cut this whole part out, but I find if you just kind of cut a little V-shaped thing like that with your knife, you can get out the little dirty particles, little bits of soil that are entwined in the roots, and still get most of the vegetable itself. Celery root has got great flavor. There's a couple different ways I like to cook this. One of my favorites is to grate it raw. It's a little tough. If you have a food processor, it makes it easier, but you can hand grate it on a hand grater. And then there's a really classic French dish called celery root remoulade. And a remoulade in classic French cooking is really just a tarragon flavored mayonnaise. But in the South, remoulades have become much more complicated. They're kind of not exactly 1,000, but usually there's a little bit of tomato paste and some pickly stuff, but a kind of a creamy mayonnaise based dressing with a lot of spices and flavorings in it. But that's a great salad. It's also very good. You can mix it with, you can take a winter squash, and most of them you don't have to peel. Butternut squash must be peeled. Even the tiniest bits of butternut squash peel are flinty and hard, and you can taste them. But you could cut this squash up, cut off the peel, and grate it. And a combination of grated raw winter squash and grated celery root is a fabulous salad. The other thing I like to do with celery root is to mash it with potatoes. About half celery root, half yellow potatoes, olive oil and salt is all you need. It makes a really, really great mashed dish. Tons of flavor. It's a good addition to soups. You cube it up and put it into vegetable soups. It's right up there with my favorite vegetables. Turnips are kind of funny. I used to kind of joke about turnips, or that's not the turnip, this is the turnip. That they were food for cattle that humans would eat in an emergency. And I kind of still feel that way about rutabagas for the most part, but you can make them taste pretty good. But one of the things I make, and I'll talk more about it when we do the recipe template session, is fritters, making things into fritters, which is basically you take any kind of vegetable, you bind it with something, typically egg, maybe some flour, some breadcrumbs. You can add other flavorings to it, make little patties and fry them. There's a dim sum thing called turnip cake, and it's actually made from daikon radishes, but you can make something very similar with the turnip. So these I like to grate, mix them with a little flour, and you can use rice flour, wheat flour, a little bit of egg, and make kind of a light batter, and pan fry them into little it's like a pancake or fritter. And it kind of replicates that flavor of the dim sum turnip cake, which is kind of fun. These are also good. The turnips and rutabagas and potatoes also go good in very smashed root vegetable dishes. So even though I like to make fun of them, they're really pretty good. These guys have a funny name, sunchoke, also called Jerusalem artichoke, which, as far as I could tell from reading about them, was a sort of an anglicized version of the French name, which I think is girasole, which is sunflower or something or other. But anyway, Jerusalem came out of that. And they're a fun little knobby tuber. They have kind of a nutty flavor. They can be thinly sliced and fried. They can be mashed. The one thing, these are nice and clean ones, but you really have to scrub them well. So it's good to soak some of these root vegetables that have a lot of crags, put them in a bowl of water for a while, and then get a little brush, either an old toothbrush or a vegetable brush. You can brush out this dirt and stuff, and then you can leave them whole. They don't really need to be peeled. It's trying to peel one of these little things, you waste about half of it. So it's better not to try to peel do some artichokes.
So, Jim, we have another question.
Another question?
You'll need to repeat the question because
Okay.
I can't hear it. How do you store your onions?
How do I store my onions? We have a question about storing onions. I keep onions in a room temperature in a dark space. And that's really true for almost all the root vegetables, winter vegetables. The enemy of these vegetables is moisture. And I'll sometimes put things in the refrigerator like this. If I'm in a hurry, I just throw them in a bag. But your crisper drawer tends to be more humid. So you want to make sure that if it has a little slots that they're open to let humidity out. Onions, though, do not, I think they suffer more than other vegetables in the refrigerator. So I have a little corner in my pantry that's a little dark corner that I put the onions in there, and they stay dark, and they'll keep for quite a long time. The big yellow onions are actually called storage onions, and they're cured so that they last longer. They will eventually start to rot if they get a little moisture on them, but we go through so many onions, it's not really an issue. If I have an onion in my kitchen that's been there for 3 or 4 days, it's unusual. And the same with these other vegetables, any of these root vegetables, and even carrots can be stored at room temperature, preferably in a basket or something. Dark place is better than light. Light tends to generate kind of the plant's activities. These are root vegetables are energy storage for the next year's plant. So they're waiting for something to trigger them to start growing again. And that's when you see things sprouting and stuff. It's like, oh, it's time to grow again. So if you keep them in the dark, it tends to suppress that. But for the most part, the vegetables, if you, even in a CSA box, you're probably gonna end up putting most of them in the refrigerator, and that's okay, but just keep your eye on them because I said moisture, it could be a problem, and things that are leafy and green, like the tops of the leeks and the green onions, they'll start to wilt. Cabbage holds up pretty well in the refrigerator. It will tend to oxidize. That's when you see that kind of graying, browning color on the outside of vegetables. It's oxidation, and you can just trim that off. It's not harmful. It's not really mold. Any other questions from the crowd? We went through our hour pretty quickly.
Yeah, that was super fast.
Well, I can give you a little preview of what we're going to talk about next. Our next one, I'll do that. So on Wednesday nights, I want to talk to you a little bit about what Catherine calls recipe templates. It's a phrase I borrowed or stole from her, but it's a really good one where you have different things that they're similar, and you have this base idea. Like her fried rice template is a good one. You have leftover rice. You have a couple of uncooked aromatic vegetables. You have a little left peas or something in the refrigerator. You might throw in an egg. You might have something pickled. And it doesn't have to be one pickled thing. It could be like some kimchi, it could be chopped up dill pickles, whatever. And then maybe a condiment or two. And so those kind of templates let you pick and choose between the leftover things in your kitchen, and you can throw them together and make a quick meal. And it's really the way that we eat here at my house. We frequently I'll caramelize a big, like 5 or 6 onions. I'll chop them up and spend an afternoon. Caramelizing onions takes a while. They have to cook for about an hour really to get them kind of nice and dark. So I'll have a thing of caramelized onions. Always have cooked beans. I frequently will have either cooked rice or another cooked grain. We'll talk about those. There's lots of really wonderful grains besides rice. I love rice, but there's this fairly new naked barleys. They're called, a hulless barley that is a really great grain that has a wonderful flavor. Farro, there's a parched green wheat that we sell, made also by the Ayers Creek Farm people, called Fricka. And so we'll talk about those. But so have some cooked grains in the refrigerator. And then there's always little bits and pieces of leftovers. And so the templates are ways that you can kind of look in your refrigerator and say, oh, what do I have? Like I might look in there and say, oh, there's a little bit of leftover cooked, pulled pork. There's some of my salted cabbage. I've got some tortillas. I have some beans. So I can throw those together. I can either make tacos, quesadillas, chilaquiles, kind of go that route, or I could just heat up a bowl of beans and greens. One of the things I eat probably more than anything else is beans and greens. So having those kind of things in your kitchen This allows you a lot more freedom. You can kind of mix them up, mix and match. I have another question.
Can you talk a little bit about your vinegar and show us what it is?
This vinegar, the question was about the vinegars. So Katz vinegars are made in Napa. A guy named Albert Katz and his wife Kim have this small company. Albert's a former chef in the Bay Area, but he's one of the few people that makes what are called Orleans method vinegars. And it's really the sort of the anecdotal story that I'm not really sure if it's true or not, is that Orleans vinegars are named after an incident where some wine was on barges going up whatever river goes to Orleans, France, and got stuck in the mud and sat there for a couple of months, turned to vinegar. So they started calling it Orleans vinegar. But it's really a long, very long fermentation period. Most vinegars start off as alcohol. And alcohol, the secondary fermentation to acetic acid, is called by bacteria called acetobacters. They go through, they consume the alcohol. The byproduct is acetic acid, and that becomes alcohol, becomes vinegar. Modern vinegars are made in what are called vinegar generators, and it's basically a big machine where they pump in the base alcohol, they pump in a lot of air and the acetobacters, and it turns around for day and it comes out as vinegar. Katz's, the Orleans method, they make the source wines, and they make the source apple cider in this particular one, which is made from Gravenstein apples, the heirloom varietal that grows down in Sonoma. So they make the source alcohols, and then they have a big old stone barn outside of Napa in the Susan Valley. It's the valley to the east of Napa. And they make the vinegars in these giant oak barrels. And it takes about 3 or 4 months to make a batch of vinegar. It's a long, slow, like I said, secondary fermentation, and it really retains all the flavor characteristics of the source wine. So you have these much more nuanced depth of flavor vinegars. And I met Albert 15 years ago at an olive oil conference in California at UC Davis. And he started talking about olive oil, but he started talking about vinegar. And I'm like, I wanted some of that vinegar. These Portland chefs and chefs all over the country can't get enough of this vinegar because it has so much flavor. He has, besides the apple cider, he makes a delicious red wine vinegar, a white wine vinegar, and he makes some from late harvest grapes that he calls agrodolce. Agrodolce is Italian for kind of sweet and sour. So he uses a late harvest wine and then ferments into vinegar. And he says it's kind of tricky because the acetobacters don't like the sugars in there, so they have to be monitored a little more carefully. And his inspiration for those, he was drinking Sauternes, which is a fabulous dessert wine from France. And he thought, I wonder if you could make this into vinegar. And so he did. He makes these really nice sweet sour vinegars, and they have a huge amount of flavor. This is a pretty standard ingredient in many, many things I cook. Lots of things get a splash of vinegar. We do a lot of composed salads of just different things that you eat in room temperature with grains and pickles and fresh vegetables. And these vinegars make a huge difference in the amount of flavor. So I'm really happy that we have them in our store. We have another question.
So what is the name of the vegetable that is pink inside, and how do you cook it?
So this is a watermelon radish. And these have only been, they've been around for a while, but they've become much more popular on the market in the last 10 years or so. Typically, a lot of them are eaten raw, but they're actually a lot of radishes, or most radishes, I think, do well being cooked. You can roast them. You could cut this into wedges. You don't even need to peel it. Just kind of clean it up a little bit. The peel's very edible. Cut it into quarters or wedges. I would do it like this, maybe like this. So you have pieces like this. And then toss these with a little olive oil, throw them in a 400-degree oven for about 25 or 30 minutes so they get kind of fork tender, and sprinkle, of course, salt over them. They're good that way. You can add them to things. I know that Hugh Akeson, who's a chef in the South, cubes them and sautés them. There's another way to cook. But they're also very good raw. They're a nice salad ingredient. They're very visually striking if you slice them across the horizon. So you get this kind of cross section. They're very pretty in salads and things. They're a nice garnish as well. They're much milder than red radishes too. And another question.
So talk about, so someone's asking about, they have a small CSA, but they still can't get through. It's only family of two.
Family of two.
How about freezing?
Freezing, yeah. So the question is, even if you have a small CSA and there's only a couple people in the household, what do you do with the stuff that you still have left over when the next CSA box arrives? We do a lot of freezing. The blanching technique, or parboiling, where any vegetables, just drop it in some boiling water for a while, and you can look up or check out Catherine's website for guidelines of that. But basically, for a couple of minutes for most things, cook them a little bit, drain them, and freeze them, and they'll last for quite a long time. It's a good technique, yeah. And you can use Ziploc bags, even or deli containers to freeze vegetables are perfect for that, yeah.
We're getting some love for your bean pot.
Oh.
Tell us how to get your bean pot.
Well, like many things in the kitchen, this bean pot came from a thrift store. I had another one that I used for years and years and years. There was more of a traditional bean, rounded with a much smaller opening. And I dropped the lid one time taking it out of the oven. My oven had this old Wedgwood oven, and it's kind of a tight fit in there. And I was pulling it out and dropped it and cracked the lid. And I was just heartbroken. But my wife is an inveterate thrift store shopper, and within a day she had a new bean pot. This one, I can't remember the brand, but there are a lot of them. I mean, you can go to any Goodwill and there's probably, you'll see like a half dozen ceramic bean pots on the shelf. My bean cooking technique, I was inspired to do it this way. There was an article in Savour about 10 or 15 years ago about the Tuscans, and they're sometimes called mangiafagioli, means the bean eaters. They love to eat beans. And this is based on an old Tuscan approach to cooking called fagioli al fiasco, beans in a bottle or beans in a flask. And because Italy was deforested, 1,000 years ago, most villages have a communal bread oven because not everybody can have an oven. So they would fire up the oven once a week, make bread. As the oven cooled down, they'd put things that are baked, like lasagnas or baked dishes in there. The last thing they would do is would fill a bottle with beans, water, olive oil, and salt, stuff a rag into it, and throw it in the ashes. Come back the next day, and the beans are ready. So I read this article, like, oh, that sounds good. And one old Tuscan man said, beans cooked in a metal pot aren't worth eating. And that's kind of a classic Italian chauvinistic thing to say. But anyway, so I started cooking my beans in a Pyrex dish in the oven. That was my first start. So I just took a Pyrex dish, beans, water, olive oil, salt. And I don't really measure them, but that sort of 1 to 4 is a pretty good ratio. But like I said, it varies depending on the beans. But so roughly 1 part beans, 4 parts water, spoonful of salt, glug, glug, glug of olive oil, covered the Pyrex dish with foil, 200-degree oven. Cook until done. My favorite instruction, cook until done. And if you smell them cooking, check and add water to keep them covered. Most beans, these beans are quite small, these purgatorios. These took about 4 hours. Fat beans like Corona beans, much bigger, take much longer. And I'll frequently, sometimes I'll start them in the evening, let them cook for a couple hours, and then turn the oven off and just leave them in there overnight. And they get done. It's dangerous because that tends to dry them out a little bit too. So you might want to add more water if you're doing the overnight technique. But like I said, you should be able to find a bean pot in the thrift store, or you can look online too. They all seem to have maddeningly small lids. Every bean pot I've had has a little tiny lid. So when it's hot, you're grabbing it with a towel or something, or it's easy to lose your grip on them. So be careful with your bean pot. They're easy to break.
Okay, last question. Tips for green onions. They get slimy fast.
They do get slimy fast. You just have to eat them. Yeah. Oh, somebody asked about green onions because they tend to get kind of slimy quickly in the refrigerator. And it's really true. They don't last a long time. When you look at a green onion, you can see the outer skins are on the outside like this, and they're usually a little dry. And then eventually, as they start to break down, it gets really kind of slimy down at the tip. When I'm prepping onions, I'll just cut the tip off like this. And then I'll start pulling down the outermost layer of skin to peel it down. And when they get to that slimy point, you can usually cure them that way too. You can cut the end off, pull off a layer, like this is maybe the outermost layer here, and just slide down. This is a really fresh one, so it's not slimy at all, but you just start pulling the layers off. And actually, this movement where you have the onion, the ends cut off, and you run your fingers down like this. It kind of pulls off that outer skin, and you get down to the core. So even if they look a little funky, I mean, you should try to salvage them because there's usually something worth in there. I've many's a time I've done that same thing. I look in there, oh, those green onions are getting pretty far gone. I better cook them up. And you may start out with one like this, and by the time you trim it up, it's this long, and you just have a little bit left. But they're usually salvageable. But again, it's the kind of thing. Some things don't last forever, so don't sit on your green onions too long. You can also chop them up and then put in a little bowl, and then it'll last a little bit longer once the root's off.
Last question. Do you pre-soak your beans?
one last question. Do I pre-soak my beans? I don't. When I do the fagioli and fiasco, the beans in the oven, I don't soak them. Steve Sando, the guy behind Rancho Gordo, who's probably the most famous bean vendor and cooker in America, he says that, you know, he says sometimes he soaks, but he goes, soaking time could be cooking time. And Steve and I both sort of agree on the fact that we love just kind of plain beans. I mean, the beans that come out of there are just cooked with olive oil, salt, and water. I just eat them just like that regularly because good beans taste good. And Steve does the same way, but he cooks his on the stovetop, but he's kind of the same approach. He'll say, just cook the beans plain. Don't put a lot of stuff in them so you can kind of taste the beans. And you can use the same approach on the stovetop. You tend to have a little more water because the heat is concentrated underneath them, and they tend to evaporate more quickly than they do in the oven. But I never soak them. Just like, I don't think about it. I mean, you have to, I'm going to make beans. I pull out my bean pot, throw in the dry beans, throw in the water, throw in the olive oil, put them in the oven. So you don't need to soak beans. Well, thanks everybody. Hope to see you back again on Wednesday, and we'll talk more about stuff. And I'm going to be making some fritters.
Yeah, so thank you, Jim, so much for all of that information. There's a lot of love coming through on the chat for you here. And I want to thank everybody for spending the time with us today and asking so many great questions. We have CSA ShareFair Week all week. We've got at 5 o'clock every day, we've got something new going on. Like Jim mentioned, he's got another class on Wednesday talking about template recipes. You can use those recipes to do anything with any vegetable in your share. It's pretty amazing. So join us then. And then tomorrow night, we've got a discussion on how small-scale farming is helping solve our big issues like climate change and social injustice. So if you're interested in some of the underpinning of the CSA philosophies, please feel free to tune in and join us. You just need to RSVP so I can send you the link. I also wanted to let you all know that we've got a new website this year, www.tnwcsa.org, and we have a searchable map. So if you are looking for a CSA and you want to know where they drop off and where the farms are, head on over to our website. There's a find your farm function. You can put in attributes like big share, small share, do they take SNAP, do they do home delivery? So it really can help you find a good share that's right for you and your lifestyle. And finally, one more plug for our donation giveaways. For the first 25 people to donate $50 get a tote bag, and the first 25 people to donate $100 get a tote bag full of $150 of all kinds of delicious food. So thank you everyone, and it's been a pleasure to have you online tonight, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow. Bye-bye.